All right, welcome back to biology. My name is Mr. Kubuske. We've been in the middle of Unit 8, which is all about genetics. If you recall, if we can do a little recap, first time we got together, we talked about Mendel. We talked about his laws, like the law of segregation, which means chromosomes separate, law of independent assortment, which means that the pairs are pulled individually, and there's no rhyme or reason to the way that we're given our traits. And then from that, we did basic genetics, Punnett squared, big R, little r, and dominant, recessive. Then we went on to advanced genetics, talk about codominance, incomplete dominance. Remember, they both show, meaning that the colors, for example, will show up side by side. If it's incomplete, then there's like a blending when we had the red flower and the white flower, and then they cover up and make a pink flower. That would be incomplete dominance. Okay. Then we stepped into multiple allele traits and sex-linked traits. Remember, sex-linked traits, the ones that we looked at were all recessive, meaning that they're going to show up more in males than in females. Today we'll talk about what happens if it's sex-linked dominant. And then multiple alleles, it was like blood typing. We learned about how the I and the A and the B and the O. Blood types, we talked about that. I don't know if I ever mentioned the I stands for immunoglobulin, which means that it has the marker protein. That's the marker protein's name. And then you just designate whether it's an A or a B. But that's neither here nor there. Today we're going to talk about pedigrees. And what that means is we're going to kind of track how a trait is passed through your family from great-grandparents to grandparents to parents to you to your offspring to your grandchildren and so on and so forth. Okay, that's what pedigrees are used for. A lot of times pedigrees are associated with dogs. Like if your dog has papers, what that means is your dog is purebred, and we can prove that by going through the family lineage of your dog, looking at his parents or her parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. They're all going to be the same type of breed, which means your dog is purebred. Okay, and people pay a lot of money for purebred dogs. That's why my little joke over here is funny. You have registered poodles for $350, registered Labradors for $350, and then Labradoodles for $2,500. Believe it or not, my parents have a Labradoodle. He's a great little dog. Okay, anyway. So we're going to cover what pedigrees are, what they're used for, and then we're going to talk about how to actually make pedigrees using the symbols that are associated with pedigrees. Okay. So what is a pedigree? A pedigree is a diagram of the history and the path of a trait from one generation to the next. In other words, it's a family tree. We can watch the trait go from parent to offspring and so on and so forth. Okay. And then what's a pedigree used for? Pedigrees are used to show the path of that trait through your family. You can watch how the traits either come or go, if they disappear or reappear, and then you can actually also predict like your offspring. What are the chances that your children will have a certain trait, or that your grandchildren will. And then it's also good, like if there's a defect in your family, like hemophilia. If you know there's a history of hemophilia in your family, you can predict what the chances of your child having hemophilia will be. This was important to the Kaiser or the Tsar, I forget which one it was back in the olden days. Okay, so let's talk about the symbols that are used. Okay, males, we're square. Females, okay, you're circles. Okay. Males are always square, females are always circles. If there's a line in between them, what that means is that they have mated, so they're going to produce offspring. Now, to show that you're going to produce offspring besides the mating, okay, we bring a line straight down, okay, and then we're going to have this little connecting line between the different offspring, okay? So, like, here's a brother, sister, brother, okay? So they had two boys and one girl, okay? So that's how you show the offspring. So offspring always placed below the parents, okay? Now, since each one of these is a different generation, generations are labeled with Roman numerals. Okay, so I've got Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, so I have two generations here. And then the individuals themselves, we give them numbers. We just number from left to right. And usually when you make these, you go oldest to youngest, left to right. But as you get to bigger and bigger family trees and pedigrees, it doesn't always work out that way. But usually this is how we kind of started. This is the starting point. So the reason we number like this is, like, let's say I was going to ask you a question like, tell me person Roman numeral 2-2. What is the sex of that person? Okay. Well, then I would go, okay, Roman numeral 2 means second generation, and then it's the second person over, so I'd go to the second person. So that is a female right there. So that's how we answer questions about people that are in the pedigree. Okay. If the person is affected, then we color them in. Okay, so like this, let's say the father has the trait, and then his daughter has the trait. Okay, so we're going to color them in. That means they have the trait. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. It doesn't mean that, let's say, that it's a disorder. It just means whatever trait we're looking for, like hitchhiker's thumb, widow's peaks, right hand folding versus left hand folding. PTC tasters, okay? Those are all examples of genes that you can track. You can track any gene theoretically through a family. Usually it's easier with the genes that are affected by just one or excuse me, traits that are affected by just one gene. It's harder with things that are polygenic, like hair color. We'll talk about that here in a little bit, though. Okay. All right. If you know that someone is heterozygous for an autosomal trait, which means that it is not on the X chromosome, you can, if you know that they're heterozygous ahead of time, you can half color them in. So, like, let's say mom's heterozygous, so that means she has half. Okay, and then she gives that on to her kids. Okay, so actually, as I look at the trait that I'm looking at here, okay, my guess is that the trait that I'm looking at is probably a recessive trait, and the reason for that is that mom must have given her dominant trait, whatever this one is, to these two boys, which means they must be heterozygous. But the two black halves came together here to make the daughter, which is why she also has the trait. So this would be an autosomal recessive trait that I'm looking at, and I just made that up off the cuff, okay? Meaning the pedigree, but I can figure that out, and we'll talk about how we can figure that out here in a little bit, okay? If there's twins, like let's say they have another set of kids, they're going to have, oh, let's just have one more, okay? And then they end up having twins. Twins, it almost looks like cherries here. Okay, they're connected at a point. Okay, and that's for non-identical twins. If they're identical twins, you draw a line in between them. You finish off the triangle there. Okay, so I've kind of made a triangle that shows identical twins. Okay, sidebar, not to get weird, but this happens a lot in dog populations, especially for purebred dogs like Dalmatians and things like that. If there's inbreeding, not only are the brother and sister connected on the top, then you also connect them in between. Hopefully, you never have to use that. All right, moving on. Okay, if someone's a sex-linked carrier, remember that's different than being necessarily heterozygous, because here we're talking about someone that is autosomal recessive, meaning that it's not on the X chromosome. If it is on the X chromosome, like let's say color blindness, if we were tracking color blindness through this family and we said mom was a carrier, then we would do a circle with a dot in the center of it. That's how we do sex-linked carriers. If two parents are expecting and they don't know the sex of the baby yet, you put something like a diamond, or if let's say you don't know, they had another sibling but they've never met, a long-lost sibling, you put a diamond. And then if someone in the family is to pass away, you just draw a line through. Okay, that's all you do there. Okay, that you don't always have to do that. It depends on how much detail you have on your pedigree and how much detail you want to go into it. But if you ever saw that, that's how you would know what that meant. Okay. Now, there's going to be 4 types of pedigrees. 2 for autosomal traits and 2 for sex-linked traits, okay, and 1 for dominant and 1 for recessive for each. So I'm going to tell you kind of how to identify which type of pedigree you're actually looking at. We can figure out the type of trait that we're actually looking at based on the pedigree. So for example, if it's an autosomal dominant trait, it's going to show up equally in males and females, okay, and then there's not going to be it's not going to skip a generation. You're going to see it in every generation as you go down. So like on this one, this brother had, and then his offspring, 2 of the girls have it, so this must be a dominant trait. And then this person must have been heterozygous because that's the only way that she could have a daughter that is recessive over here. So she must be heterozygous. She gave her dominant trait to her boy, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's autosomal dominant. Here's another example. Again, these 2 parents must be heterozygous for the trait because they have offspring that's recessive. Now, there's a way to tell that this is dominant too. If you look at this person's non-expressing and this person's not expressing, and then all of their children are not expressing, that tells you right there that this must be the recessive part, and then these must be the dominant up here. Okay? Next one. If it is autosomal recessive, it is going to skip a generation. If 2 people that are colored in, so meaning they have the trait, when they reproduce, if all of their offspring also have the trait, that is a pretty good indication that it's probably a recessive trait as well. Because if it was dominant, if they're both dominant, they could both be heterozygous. That could be why they show dominant. But then when their offspring are born, they could have some of the offspring be recessive, meaning they wouldn't be colored in. So if we're studying a trait and you think that it's autosomal recessive, when you have 2 people colored in, all of their offspring have to also be colored in. So here's an example of that. Okay, autosomal recessive. And this actually, yeah. So here's your autosomal recessive because you've got mom that has the trait. Dad does not have the trait, which means he has a big, like let's say R. He's got a big R, and his kids, okay, he must be heterozygous because this child obviously got a big R, this child got a big R, but this child got a 2 little R's, which means he got 1 from mom and 1 from dad. But then if I look at this child and his wife, okay, when they have offspring, both of the offspring have the trait, which means that it's probably recessive because it's like saying little r, little r, little r, little r, and then both of these are little r, little r. Okay, same thing up here. This person has the trait, but then it disappears in his next generation. that tells you right there, boom, that's got to be a recessive trait. All right. Now, a little bit more complicated. This one, sex-linked dominant. It's a little tougher to follow. It doesn't skip generations. The males have to have expressing mothers, okay, which makes sense because if I'm a male, that means I got my Y from my dad, and then I can only get my X chromosome from my mom. So if mom has the trait, okay, if she is a dominant, that means she's giving me the dominant part of the trait. That means that's where I got that from. So if I'm a male that is expressing, okay, I also have to have an expressing mother. That's a way to tell if it's sex-linked dominant. Because if you remember, if it's sex-linked recessive, mom doesn't have to show the trait. We call her a carrier, but she can give the trait on to her little boys, like when we talk about color blindness and stuff like that. Okay, so here's some other things you can usually follow to see if it's going to be a sex-linked dominant. But let me show you an example. So here's an expressing mother. Here's an expressing son. That tells you right there, okay, that this must be a dominant trait. Another way to tell, mom was expressing, so she can only give that letter to her daughter. Okay, dad was not expressing. The only letter he can give to his daughter is the X little b, for example, here. Okay, and so that X little b gets covered up by mom's X big B. So this person is going to be heterozygous for this sex-linked trait, but they express it. Okay, and mom must have been heterozygous too. That's the only way that these two then could be non-expressing. Okay, but you'll notice it's X-linked, but it shows up equally in males and females. Okay, so you got to be careful. It's kind of tricky when you start to figure out. Nice to show. It is tough to be a Browns fan sometimes, but we'll talk more about that later. But it's tough. You really got to pay attention to these and follow these rules on this page to figure out if this is going to be X-linked dominant or autosomal dominant. And that's where it gets a little tricky. Okay, if it's X-linked recessive, real simple, because you really got to look at the sons. Like here, this is like saying a colorblind son and his colorblind wife all have colorblind children, which makes sense because the only letters that they can give to their kids are going to be the X little b's, for example, or X little c's if we're talking about colorblindness. Okay, but if I look here at mom, okay, mom she has the recessive traits, which means she's X little c, so her boys both got it there because that's the only letter they can get from mom. The only letter they're going to get from dad is a Y. Okay, but it does not show up in the girls. That means the dad's X big B or X big C, with that he gave to the girls, all right, protected them, but they're both going to be carriers, which makes sense because if you look now, her son has the trait because she's given that X little c to her son. Okay, so that's kind of a wrap up. So a pedigree, it's used to show the path of a trait through a family. It's used to predict possible outcomes and defects. We've talked about the symbols, circles, and squares, and how the lines go in between. And then we talked about the 4 types of pedigrees. Okay, hopefully that helps. We're going to do some practice with pedigrees. You're going to actually have to make your own pedigree based on one of these traits when we do our little project here coming up. But this is pretty much it for genetics. We'll talk about dihybrids, and that'll be the end of it. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something. I look forward to seeing you in the next unit, which is one of my favorites, evolution. See you then.